Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, man. I really appreciate you being here. Could you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, sure. Tom Samoluk. I was the deputy director of the Assassination Records Review Board back in the mid 90s.
Now, what did you do for the Assassination Records Review Board?
Well, I'm an attorney, and I was in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. So I would have done the job with the review board for free if I could have afforded it, because I had a longstanding interest in the assassination, and this opportunity came up. And so I started out, I was the communications director, and but that my role wasn't quite that confined, because I did have a lot of experience and knowledge about the assassination through my own research. Plus, I had been a prosecutor, so I kind of lended that view to the senior staff. So I handled the media inquiries. I dealt with the public. I was the point person setting up the public hearings that we conducted. But I also, as I like to say, I chased records under the law, which maybe we'll get into. Not only was it the declassification of federal records, but we also had the authority under the law to seek out records that were in private hands or in other levels of government besides the federal level, including municipal and state. So the municipal level was important because, of course, you had the site of the assassination, Dallas, and then you had the investigation that related to New Orleans. So we dealt with then District Attorney in New Orleans, Harry Connick Sr., when we were declassifying records. So I really liked the pursuit of the records, which really brought me to New Orleans a lot. Records related to the Garrison investigation and prosecution, and as well as going to Dallas a lot, not only for the public hearings actually in Dallas, as well as New Orleans, Boston, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. So I like to think of myself as a multi-purpose senior staffer when I was with the Assassination Records Review Board. And that's what made the job even more exciting than just being part of something so historic as what we were asked to do.
Now, when I spoke with Thunheim, he didn't have an interest in the JFK assassination when he was assigned to the ARRB. Now, if you had a prior interest, can you tell me how that got started? I mean, I'm not assuming you didn't just watch it on, all the stuff that unfolded later when you were a kid, but I mean, did you believe the official story when it came out? Did you think that there was something suspicious going on, that you were really excited to join the ARRB?
Well, it's a really good question. I think the history for me personally is important. I born in Boston, grew up largely outside Boston, but lived in Boston when I went back to law school, but was actually living with my family of 6 kids outside Boston. We had moved probably a year before the assassination, and so was living in a suburb of Boston. Remember the day like yesterday. I got off the school bus. We had not been told in school. So 6 years old, in first grade, I was met at the end of the street, got off the bus, and my 4-year-old brother conveyed what he understood to happen in the way a 4-year-old would. And I walked into the house, and my mother had the TV on, which was not unusual that she would have the TV on. It was obviously a Friday afternoon, November 22nd, 1963. But as she was ironing in our family room with the TV on, she was crying. And I knew something was wrong. and understood more clearly what my little brother had told me that had happened. So that was important to me growing up in Boston, in the Boston area. You couldn't help but be influenced by President Kennedy. In fact, my oldest sister still has a couple of scrapbooks that she kept when President Kennedy was elected to the Senate in 1952. So you grew up in this area with the presence and inspiration of President Kennedy and the entire family. So that's the background for me at 6 years old. I probably am among the youngest of people who are alive today that have any personal recollection of where they were on the assassination. Because if you're younger than me, then you were 5 or 4 at the time of the assassination, and many people don't have personal recollections from that earlier point in their life. But I remember it like it was yesterday. And not only do I remember that Friday afternoon, I remember the weekend where it was wall to wall network coverage of the assassination. And then on Sunday, my father did something very unusual. For Sunday dinner, he moved a small TV into the dining room because he was so fixated, as all of America was, on the coverage of the assassination. And so we had the TV on and actually watched Jack Ruby shoot Lee Harvey Oswald, like so many other Americans. And I remember that day too. And I remember the funeral from that Monday morning. So that is what really was the beginning for me of an interest in the assassination, because I was old enough at 6 years old to understand the basics of what had happened. Now, in the subsequent months and years, various memorial books came out about President Kennedy. Some included photos that were available at that time from Dealey Plaza. And I remember after the assassination, and when those books came out, my oldest sister, Carol, who had kept the scrapbooks and was devastated by the assassination, she had all the memorial books. And I would look at the books and look at the scene in Dealey Plaza. And even at 6 years old and then 7 years old and older, I wondered what happened, what really happened there. And so I, even at a young age, I had an interest. And then as I grew up, I, like other kids, had interest in sports and did all the other things that kids do and did from that era. But I always was interested when there was something that came out about the assassination, including the investigations that were done by the Congress, the Church Committee, ultimately the House Select Committee on Assassinations. But even before that, I remember in 1973, there was renewed interest in the assassination. A movie, and I believe it is also a book that you may recall, Robbie, Executive Action. It's got quite a cast. I don't know if the movie did that well, but Executive Action was about the assassination, and I was riveted by that. And there were a lot of clips about the movie and renewed interest in the assassination. And I have clips going back to then to 1973. Then in 1975, around the time of the Church Committee, you will recall that Geraldo Rivera showed the Zapruder film on late night television. And I remember waiting with anticipation to see the Zapruder film, and stayed up and watched it. Obviously, in 1975, the days before VCRs were available to consumers. But I do remember that I audio taped that show. I was so interested in what was going on. Then there was more coverage, and ultimately that helped propel the Congress to create the Select Committee on Assassinations on the House side, and I followed all of that. So my interest continued, reading all the books, any documentaries. It was always an interest with the fundamental question: what happened?
Now, when it came to requesting documents, if you had an interest from the beginning and you kind of followed it along, even though you might have taken a break at some certain points, um, you knew what documents to request for, just interesting areas that maybe some other members of the Assassination Records Review Board didn't. I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts on the House Select Committee on Assassinations documents requesting? I mean, I spoke with Blakey and he feels now, and I'm pretty sure he's felt for the past 10, 15 years, that the CIA was not giving him all the information when it came to document requesting. And I've looked through plenty of documents to show that he would request something and they would say national security, which is something Thunheim explained to me about issues with why would they keep a document for national security. But were you given full access, even though you were under law, basically, to have all the access to any of the documents that you were going to request? I mean, did you come across any issues? Did you come across any revelations?
Yeah, well, it was really quite eye-opening. Although I had been in law enforcement at the county and state level in Massachusetts, it was a whole new ball game dealing with the intelligence community for the federal government, including the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, Secret Service, and many agencies beyond that had records from the assassination. So there was, you can imagine, a law creates an independent federal board that can order the agencies what to do. They didn't like it. I think that you probably have heard about some of the early FBI appeals that were unsuccessful to appeal decisions that the review board had made. Ultimately, the only one that could decide to overrule the board was the president of the United States, and President Clinton and his general counsel. They said, "You all are going to have to work this out, and we don't want this coming back to the president." And that was my recollection. And ultimately, it was worked out. So instead of in that sequence of documents, instead of the documents being totally withheld, they were released with redactions. And my recollection is that there were maybe 5 or 6 documents that related, FBI documents that related to Oswald after he defected and being in Europe in 1960, 3 years plus before the assassination. But to your question, do I think that we saw everything? Let me put it this way. I think that the agencies took an attitude that we have been here for a long time. We were here before the Assassination Records Review Board was created. They'll be around for only a limited time, and we'll still be here, and they will be gone. And so I think that there was that type of attitude that they would outlast us. So that was the attitude that they had. But I think the review board did a great job of pressing the agencies and getting some important records that really round out the history surrounding the assassination. And I think that specifically relevant to the CIA, and I know in addition to talking to Judge Thunheim, you've talked to Jefferson Morley, who has been focused on the CIA documents that have to do with George Joannides. And of course, the CIA had not been honest with the House Select Committee on Assassinations on the role that George Joannides had. The House Select Committee, their understanding was he was the liaison in 1977, 78, 79, that period. But little did the House Select Committee know that he had had the role running the anti-Castro groups, and one of them, of course, which Oswald had a run-in with in the summer of '63. So those records should be released, and not everything has been released that's relevant to Joannides. They were not, because of the fact that the CIA was not forthcoming with the review board. They're not officially part of those records that were designated, but they should have been, and the CIA should release those records, but they still haven't done so.
I mean, it's not really a question of national security, but do you think it's something like, I mean, during the 60s and 70s, the FBI created a fake magazine on college campuses called The Rational Observer. It was basically to counter all the claims about or the anti-Vietnam propaganda that was going on during the 60s and 70s, but they were implementing these on college campuses. I mean, do you think it's something like that with the Fair Play for Cuba committee? Do you think that was a whole I know people say sheep dip type thing, but do you think it was a way to try and find out communists? I mean, they went to a far extent to try and find, and I try and look for a more rational answer than a conspiracy one. So I'm looking at like the height of what communism was back then. I mean, they invaded Hollywood looking for communists. They did a bunch of stuff. So I wouldn't put it above them to see that from a military standpoint of a fear of communism aspect.
Yeah, I think that there is still a culture at the CIA, and I think that they start out with that, even though 60 years, almost 60 years after the assassination, you don't have anybody there that was around at the time of the assassination, or some of the records are from before the assassination. But I think the culture is still there, and I think they convinced themselves and in turn convinced the White House that there is relevance even today to what's in those documents. And we heard in the mid 90s some of the explanations from the CIA that if we release this particular document, then foreign governments, that unfriendly governments will be able to figure out things that we're doing today. But now, in some instances, we would not redact or hold back the whole document. We would redact a name because they said a former CIA operative who retired undercover someplace in Europe would still be in danger when we were releasing records in 95 or 96. And so the review board gave the CIA the benefit of the doubt and said, okay, we'll redact the name, but we're going to release the document, and the document's going to be released eventually. And of course, the key date was going to be October 26th, 2017, when President Trump was in office, because everything was supposed to be released unless there was documented reason, which back in the mid 90s, we would not have imagined that 25 years later in 2017, that there would be anything that still needed to be kept classified. Yet here we are, not 2017, 2023, and everything has not been released. And I have been away from the documents now, obviously, for since 1998, when the review board turned out the lights on its existence and literally handed the final report to President Clinton. But I just can't imagine what there is in the remaining records that whether it has to do with an individual or practices or national security. I just don't believe it. I'd love to be back in that world and look at the documents and say, what are you talking about? But I'm assuming that some of the rhetoric that the CIA uses about why the records can't be released is the same thing that they told us in the mid 90s. And I just don't think it still holds water.
When it comes to New Orleans, what were you able to find out about New Orleans?
Yeah, that was a really interesting chapter. We actually got in a fight with, not a physical fight, but a fight over records with then District Attorney Harry Connick Sr. And they all revolved around the prosecution of Clay Shaw. So there were grand jury records, interview records, and a lot of interesting stuff that we really thought added to the public record, which was all about the review board's task, as you know, Robbie. It wasn't about trying to solve the crime. That wasn't what the law said. We were to release records as robustly as we could related to the assassination. And as I said earlier, that would be federal records or municipal and state records. So New Orleans added to the collection, but it wasn't just what Harry Connick said. And it's kind of interesting. It's an interesting chapter for me. The reason we got in this tiff with Harry Connick was because he, during the hearing that we had in New Orleans, and actually in the pre-hearing interview, said that, and he succeeded Jim Garrison as DA, and he didn't like Garrison. And he said that the Garrison people, prior to leaving office, had taken a lot of the records from the Clay Shaw investigation. Well, and this is documented in news coverage. An investigator for Garrison who had stayed on once Connick became DA uh, had been told by Connick, and it was an interesting story. They were in the grand jury records room, and Connick told this investigator, Gary Raymond, to get rid of everything in the room. They said they're old records. We don't need them. And Gary Raymond told me that he said, but to Connick, but boss, the Clay Shaw grand jury records are in here. And Gary Raymond said, the DA turned to him and said, Gary, is that prosecution of Clay Shaw an active case? And of course, it wasn't. Clay Shaw had been found not guilty. And so Gary Raymond said to the DA, no, of course not, boss. You know, Clay Shaw was acquitted. And he said, right. So burn these sons of bitches. He wanted Gary Raymond to take the records to the city incinerator, but instead, Gary Raymond took the records home. He put them in the trunk of his car and he took them home, where he kept them from, I think it was 1975 until 1995, when he was watching our hearing on TV live in New Orleans. The 5 members of the review board, like a congressional hearing, with witnesses called to a witness table. And he heard Harry Connick testify that the Garrison people had pilfered the files and there wasn't really much of anything left. Gary Raymond knew that not to be true, called a reporter in New Orleans he knew, and ultimately those records ended up in Washington, D.C. with us. Connick sued us, and we won. He tried to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get the Supreme Court to rule against the review board. The Supreme Court chose not to take up the records, and we got the records, got to keep the records, and they're in the National Archives at College Park. I'll tell you one funny thing. Because we were a federal agency, our legal counsel was the Justice Department. So after the fight was underway with District Attorney Connick, the attorney from the Justice Department was in our offices going over what had happened, and Connick had sued us. And so he said, let me suggest to you that no members of the review board nor staff go to Louisiana while this is pending, because the DA could have you arrested. I wouldn't put it beyond him. So we had to stay out of Louisiana for a while, but it was an interesting chapter. But the important thing, Robbie, is that we did get a lot of records from District Attorney Connick that people, researchers like you, could find and may pick up interesting elements of the story.
I mean, how many calls did you have to go to or email responses did you have to reply to when it came to some person who had documents that were in their basement or their garage or something that had been there for years? I mean, the destruction is another question. That is a very serious issue, especially when it comes to, I mean, I think Thunheim requested for death threats against the president, and those were destroyed 2 weeks after requesting them by the Secret Service members. Now, a lot of this gets really chalked into the conspiracy thing. And I mean, that's their fault for destroying documents that lead to that, but it goes into a bigger aspect of protecting the agency's credibilities as well too. I mean, the eyes of how they look into the public is a big thing for them. I mean, there's in the 22 release and in the 2017 release, it says Garrison's attempts to embarrass the agency. You don't want your government doing that. You don't want your government talking about you like you're going to embarrass them. And you kind of start diving a little bit deeper into some of what these documents hold. Now, back then, a destruction of a document of a Clay Shaw trial might not seem like anything because, oh, it's over with. It's not going to, but for historical purposes, and maybe later down the road, if someone sees an angle that might be interesting to pursue, it would be important to have those documentation. But to the first question, when it comes to the number of calls you had to respond to or emails you had to respond to about going to some person's house because they have documents in their basement.
Well, Well, and that was one of the interesting parts of what the review board was doing, and in many instances, specifically involving me. And I'll give you a couple of examples, which I think you'll find interesting. And one of them relates to New Orleans. I'll just say parenthetically, we also got records from people that were involved with Clay Shaw. So a reporter, very enterprising New Orleans newspaper reporter, uh, got to see some records that were Clay Shaw's records, the actual records, including a diary that Clay Shaw had kept. And so we were very interested in that. And so I contacted the reporter and I said, can you put us in contact with these friends, survivors of Clay Shaw? Because he had died long before. Again, this is the mid 90s when we're with the review board and it's up and active. So this reporter put me in contact with a friend of Clay Shaw's who was in possession of the records. And I convinced him that I was with the federal government, but our sole reason for existing was to add to the record of the assassination and get those records available. Would they be willing to part company with them? Because they had actually, in the 30 years since Clay Shaw, I think it was about 30 years since Clay Shaw had died after he was acquitted, the records had been passed through many different friends of Clay Shaw. By the time I find the holder of the records at that time, and I think I established my credibility that what I was going to do if he would give the records to us was take them to Washington and get them to the National Archives. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. But the journey was a little bit more complicated than that because I ended up after making the connection through the New Orleans reporter, I ended up renting a car after flying into New Orleans, going to Waveland, Mississippi. And that's where the gentleman lived that had the records. And I got to tell you, Robbie, it was like out of a scene from a movie. We were not a big agency, so I'm traveling by myself in a rented car. I arrive, I find my location, and sure enough, he has boxes of records. I don't remember specifically how many boxes it was, but he turned them over and was glad that the Clay Shaw perspective, the Clay Shaw records, would join all those other records for the public, for those who are interested, like yourself, to see those records. So that was an interesting chapter. So that was a phone call that I initiated to a reporter. I had on the Harry Connick records, the reporter, a different reporter on that front, he had called me and said, I'm sending you some records," and that's how we ended up getting them. But you're right. There were various phone calls, and one interesting thing that happened was that Judge Thunheim and I went to Dallas. We went a lot, but in addition to the hearing that was held in Dallas, and I said we got to get you in the newspaper and on the media because Judge Thunheim always said we don't know if somebody's got photographs, a film, or a document in a shoebox in the closet somewhere in the Dallas area. Maybe their parents were, or a grandparent had been there that day, taken a photograph, acquired photographs, somehow connected. So we got Judge Thunheim an interview with the big Dallas newspaper, and front page. I think the photo was of Judge Thunheim in Dealey Plaza, and in the article he said, "We think that there are maybe films, photographs out there that are relevant to the assassination. It should be part of the record. We didn't expect to see anything that was going to break the case, but you don't know. We didn't know what was out there." And so, sure enough, I got a call from another reporter, a Dallas reporter, who said, "We got a call from a person who says that they have been in possession of outtakes from the day of the assassination, outtakes that were literally thrown on the floor as they tried to, again, in the days of film, as they tried to get things up on TV. And so he had it was actually a daughter of someone who had worked at this local Dallas TV station, had a reel, I think it was 2 reels of 16 millimeter outtakes. And so the reporter, the Dallas reporter, wanted to write the newspaper article, and interestingly, was married to a CBS news producer for Dan Rather, if you can believe it. So now we got the Dallas newspaper, CBS, and Dan Rather, who, of course, is part of the assassination story. They want this film. We want the film. And we reached a compromise. I don't know if it was the right compromise or not, but I flew from Washington to Dallas like in a flash. I think I packed an extra pair of pants and
Good
some
on you.
underwear,
Good on
and
you. It's all you need. One pair for the week.
yep, and some deodorant, and got on a plane and rented a car, and met the family who had the film, which it had moved. It had survived a fire, probably because it was in a film canister, and I took the film back to Washington. I couldn't get a flight back to Washington that night, so I stayed at a like a Motel 6 near the Dallas airport. Didn't sleep a wink. Slept with the film canister under my pillow, feeling paranoid, not knowing exactly what was on it, although knowing that it did not have the shooting itself. It was some film before the assassination, some after, around the book depository in Dealey Plaza. But anyway, the newspaper got their front page story. Dan Rather, the day after Memorial Day in 1996, led the news with it. Led the news with it the next night, but the film ended up in the National Archives.
Did
So
he show the full thing?
I'm sorry.
Did he show the full thing?
Dan Rather showed clips. He was interested in. There was some. He had a film expert, and I have not talked to him in many years. He's actually from Massachusetts. If you run across the name Dick Trask, he actually wrote a book which was about the photography around the JFK assassination. I don't know if you can still get it these days, but an interesting book. And and Dick Trask gave us a lot of information about films that he thought we should find and go after. So Dan Rather showed a lot of the outtakes around Dealey Plaza, and I think there were some outtakes that were behind the grassy knoll in the railroad yard. But it was added to the record, and we thought the federal documents were important, but any films or photographs would be important too. But like you were saying, Robbie, I got a lot of phone calls from people who said that they knew something about the assassination, and some of them panned out. We were able to get records. Some of them were just not credible, and you had to weed through all of those. And you may know the name of Richard Case Nagel,
Yeah.
a military intelligence officer. So his name had been swirling around for many years, and you may know the author Dick Russell, who wrote the 700-page book on Richard Case Nagel, The Man Who Knew Too Much. And so we had been pondering that, although to be perfectly candid, I did not think that there was anything really there relative to Richard Case Nagel. I thought that he was a troubled individual that may have said he was in possession of records and had knowledge of things that I didn't find credible. But we thought we had to pursue it. So the general counsel for the review board, somehow we found, maybe one of our investigators found an address that we could write to Richard Case Nagel, and sent the letter. And we thought we were asking him if he would talk to us. And he was in Los Angeles. And a few days later, late night at the review board offices in Washington, I got a call from a researcher who had been following what we were doing. He said, "You're not going to believe this, but a contact in law enforcement in LA tells me the police have found Richard Case Nagel dead in his apartment." And the person who was calling me um, didn't didn't know that we had sent a letter to Richard Case Nagel. So you can imagine my reaction. We just had sent the letter. It had been enough time for it to arrive, and now Richard Case Nagel is dead at his apartment in L.A. So it turned out it was a natural death. There was really, he was not in good health. But I again packed that one pair of underwear and the deodorant and got on a flight to LA. And we knew that Richard Case Nagel had a niece, may have been the only relative that he had. Somehow they had learned of his death, and they were, the niece and I believe it was her fiance, were going to be out in LA. And we agreed, again, trying to work with them. We said, you can't take anything, and we have to be there with you, namely me, again, riding solo. And but we wanted to have some legal backup protection in case there was not cooperation with the relatives who I was going to meet at the apartment. And I was met at at LAX by an assistant U.S. attorney with whom we had been in contact, and she had prepared a subpoena for me to use if I needed it, to serve upon the relatives, the niece and her fiance, if they were not cooperative with me. And of course, imagine them. They're told that this federal agency dealing with assassination records is going to meet them in LA at the apartment, and so they didn't know what they were in for. They later told me they thought it was going to be, three FBI agents in black suits with 9mm sidearms and
The
wearing
forget me pen.
sunglasses.
The forget
Yeah,
me pen. Yeah.
and there was me, just me showed up, and I was looking for cooperation, not confrontation, and they were cooperative, and we went together through all the records that were there, and some are in the archives. There wasn't much there. There wasn't much that was relevant. And if I recall correctly, and if I don't get this completely accurate, forgive me, because it's been a while since I've been day to day in the record, so to speak. But Nagel had always talked about a trunk full of records and relevant materials that he had. Well, we didn't find that trunk at his apartment, which, by the way, wasn't in the best neighborhood in LA. He was down on his luck, not doing well, and it was a real bad neighborhood near Dodger Stadium. So that was a personal note that I wanted to add for me, that the job was sometimes a little bit scary what we were doing. But months later, I would guess it was, got a call from the niece. They had found somehow they had found out that he had used a storage facility, and he had some trunks there. That is, Richard Case Nagel had some trunks, and they had them. So I flew back out to California and met them, and together we went through the trunks. I don't recall that there was anything particularly relevant, and whatever color the trunk that he had talked about, we didn't never found a trunk of that color. So whether or not that adds to the mystery, what happened to that trunk, I don't think there was much to his story. Some people might put more credence in it. As I said, Dick Russell wrote a 700-page book about him. But our point was, if there was records that were related to the assassination in any way and rounded out the story, or components or theories that people had subscribed to, and we could access records, films, photos, then we should add them to the collection. And that with Nagel was another instance where we did that.
Did you ever get paranoid about giving documents to the National Archives? Like, did you take any pictures before you sent them over there? The National Archives to me seems like a big, I mean, it's a good place to have everything there, but also, I mean, the government has access to that as well, too. I mean, the reclassification of documents is real. That is something that has been happening, and there's a big issue with that when it comes to reclassifying documents that have been released in the past. And I don't know what the excuse is for that. CIA probably has a couple of good ones up their sleeve, but it becomes a real issue because that only leads further down the conspiracy rabbit hole. Like I said, I try and find base in what's probably a more logical conclusion on the whole thing. But if they have access to the archives, I mean, they could easily take a document that they might not have had before, reclassify it. I mean, those Clay Shaw documents would just seem like, yeah, the best spot for it would be in somebody's basement, sadly, because a lot of people were scared, especially people that witnessed something and they started seeing the number of people that started dying off later. Now, I think there's an estimated 120 something. I can't verify 120 deaths. There's some stuff where I'm like, that can happen easy. Like Richard Case Miguel, if he's in bad health, easy. But Jim Cothey stepping out of a shower and gets a neck chop to the back of his neck, like that's suspicious to me. Where I'm like, no wonder none of these people said anything for all this time. They were afraid, and a lot of people kept documents. Whether it's a family member that has to call you guys up and let you guys know, hey, I got a document in this basement somewhere. But did you ever get paranoid about giving it to the National Archives?
No, no, I had complete confidence in the National Archives, and I have to say that the we were working with them so regularly. They're real people working there, and you establish relationships. And I thought that they were just trying to do their job and do what was right. They're historians, they're archivists. They have great respect for records, and so I always had confidence in them. But as far as how the American public, based through the lens that I was looking at records and seeking records, you're right. There was a lot of paranoia out there about the federal government, whether it was the family that of the former newsman that had the film canister that kept it for 30 years. They were always fearful of the federal government. They told me that. So there was that. There was the friends of Clay Shaw, very nervous and tentative about who they would be dealing with, and so that was repeated a lot. A lot of paranoia around the assassination. But you said something earlier, Robbie. Regardless of what one believes happened in Dallas, the federal government, by keeping these records classified and from the American public for so long and continuing today with a smaller number of records, but still the federal government cannot say today we have released everything, and the American public, those who are interested, can look at it. As a result, it breeds paranoia and conspiracy theories. We're never going to find the result, even if all the final result conclusively, even if the records were released that are still being held. However, we would be able to see, and the government would be able to say, that's everything. We've released everything. The American public has rights, and it's their history. And if you're interested, you can see it at the National Archives. We have to get to that point. I think that's still important today.
Who's in charge of when they do declassify a document, they upload it online or something like that? Who's in charge of the uploading and taking the pictures of it? Because some of those in the 22 release, I have major issues with when it comes to being unreadable. If it's upside down, you have to look like you have to read it through a mirror. That's difficult. Where I go, you can't just stand and take a photo or do something. I know plenty of people that scan in documents online, and that leads into another conspiracy, which is they do that on purpose. But there's a lot of stuff where they've already redacted the page, and sometimes it looks like they copied it so many times you can't even read. The whole page looks black. I'm like, I don't know what you want me to do with this.
Yeah, I had not heard that, and I've been away from it long enough that I wouldn't know the particulars. But whether or not it's people trying to get things done quickly and getting it available. But if I were you, I'd write. There's going to be a new archivist, I think, confirmed fairly soon. Someone's been nominated. There's an acting archivist right now. I'd reach out to the archive, see if you get an answer. Tell them what your gripes are about these records. The release is great, but if you can't read them, it doesn't do much for a researcher.
Now, when it comes to the public and also independent researchers that you had sent email correspondence to, I looked through the list on the Mary Farrell site, and a number of them I've had on the show, which is interesting to me. And you got to speak to Harold Weisberg. Good for you, man. I'm jealous of that
Not
100%. I've
not
looked.
not not only did I get to speak to Harold Weisberg, myself and one other staffer, we went to his house in Maryland. So we
Wait, he's
saw the
from Maryland?
famous, yeah.
That's where I'm
He lived
from.
in he lived in Maryland at that time. We saw the famous archives when they were still in his basement.
So, what the independent researchers that you had communication with, Richard Bartholomew, Jim DiEugeno, you were also in Jim's new film as well too, which was excellent. Um, did they help guide you, bring up some interesting points on some things?
Yes.
There's a number of news stories that I've seen of articles in newspaper magazines. They talked about, I think at one point there's a document about a newspaper that was saying that Clay or not Garrison had hypnotized or and I can't verify any of those, but I go, these are reports from news networks that are putting this out there to the public. So I'm like, it'd be really good if they like labeled a source or, did something like that. So I'm just interested if any researchers guided you in any way.
Yeah, the researchers you mentioned, a couple of them, Jim DiEugenio followed the review board in the mid '90s as closely as anybody, and as you noted, he was involved in the latest Oliver Stone documentary. So I was again working with Jim during that, and yes, they made suggestions on where to look for records. And Jefferson Morley, Jeff was really able to, as I recall, after records that we had released, he was the one that pieced together that George Joanides was more than the CIA said he was. And that made us feel good. I think those of us who work for the review board, on the one hand, it was the records that we released that Jeff used, which we want the records to be used to come up with the more of a focus on George Joanides. Of course, there was also frustration on our part when we found out that Joanides records were more important, that he wasn't just the liaison, that that he had in fact been involved with the anti-Castro group. So Jeff was, I believe at the time, Jeff was at the Washington Post, and he followed again closely what we were doing. There are a number of other people. Some of them you've mentioned. I had mentioned Dick Trask, the photographic expert, and one of the things that he had suggested, he said, it's well known that the Kennedy aide named Dave Powers always had an 8 millimeter camera with him, and he said he can be seen in the Secret Service backup car in Dealey Plaza with his camera, and or at least not might not be that clear, but Powers was known to be in the backup car behind the limo in the Secret Service vehicle, and he had been seen as he often would be when the president traveled. He was at Dealey Plaza, and he's in video or film taken by other people, news stations. You can see that Dave Powers has his 8 millimeter camera and is filming at the airport. So Richard Dick Trask said, "You ought to find what happened to that film." He said, "Because I've never found it." And so we tracked down Dave Powers, who was an elderly gentleman. He is now long deceased, but I found him. It wasn't hard. He was living in a suburb of Boston, and I'm from up here, so I came up, and he agreed to meet with me. I went to his house, met his wife, and I said, "Mr. Powers, what happened to the film that you were filming that day?" And he very cooperative, but he was very emotional. It was like we were talking about November 22nd, 1963, and it was last week. He had been very, if you know any of the history of the aides around Kennedy, um, Dave Powers had been with him since the first congressional campaign and was a Boston guy, very close to the president. And so he lost his best friend on November 22nd, 1963. So we talked about that day in Dealey Plaza. Interestingly, you may know Robbie this better than me. He never testified before the Warren Commission. I think that there was a letter or something that's in the record. So what I'm about to say, he had said before, and maybe had said to authors, although he was very reluctant to speak to those that he considered conspiracy theorists, which was interesting because of what I'm going to tell you that he told me that day at his home in suburban Boston. He said he remembered going down Elm Street after having made the turn and hearing pops, which obviously were the gunshots. And he said, and he kind of had a faraway look in his mind. He was going back to that day, and he said, and then the gunshots started, and he said, and I felt like we were driving into gunfire. That was interesting
And
to
he
hear
didn't want
from
to talk to
someone.
conspiracy theorists? What?
That was the disparity, because he thought that a lot of people had written books and made money basically off the death of his friend. But so he said, I felt like we were driving into gunfire. And then he kind of looked away and his eyes watered and he said, but it doesn't really matter now, does it? To him, he had lost a friend. And so that was very, very, it was emotional for me to hear this elderly man whose life had been changed forever as he saw his friend, the president of the United States, murdered a matter of feet away from him since he was in the Secret Service car. But anyway, back to the Dave Powers film. We found it. I said, Mr. Powers, what happened to the film? He said, well, I turned a bunch of records over to the JFK library. And he said, I think the film is in one of the boxes. So I went to the JFK, called up the JFK library. We were dealing with them on records that they had anyway. So we, the review board and staff, knew people at the library. And so they looked and they said, we've got this film, 8mm film in a canister. So I, again, came back up, went to the JFK library out of Columbia Point. The person that I dealt with doesn't work there still. Probably wasn't too happy to turn the film over to us, but knew we had the law on our side. And so we had to deal with Mr. Powers. And the film is at the National Archives. But I think the agreement, if I recall correctly, with Mr. Powers was that he didn't want people to have ready access to it. Although I said, can we release it to the media on the upcoming assassination anniversary? I said, and then with the understanding that that they can use it, but won't be able to use it without limits. So they released it. We were able to release it. And I've actually found it on YouTube. I don't know how it got up on YouTube, but if you look, Robbie, if you haven't seen it, just do a
I've seen
search
it.
on you've seen it. It's only about 20 seconds. And the interesting thing is, when it came to when I was still talking with him, and I'm recalling this as we talk, and I'm wondering, of course, was he filming when the shooting occurred? And so I asked him, I said, what will the film show? And he said, the film ends before we turn onto Houston Street. He said, I ran out of film in the last frame. And if you've seen it, you may recall the last frame, they're on Main Street. They haven't taken the right onto Houston, and up ahead is Dealey Plaza. But in that last frame, interestingly, Flint Hill is on the back of the presidential limousine. And so clearly he was going back and forth during the motorcade. and we know where he was when the shooting started. But he was on the back of the limousine. So anyway, we got the film as it happened. Judge Thunheim and I went to Chicago. He had been invited to be on the Oprah Winfrey Show that was going to air on November 22nd, 1996. So the 33rd anniversary of the assassination. So it being important for the public to know what the review board was up to. So we accepted the invitation for Judge Thunheim. And we also heard that Lee Harvey Oswald's widow, Marina Oswald, was going to be on the show. And I said, Judge Thunheim is not going to be on the set with Marina Oswald because we are in the middle of a dispute with her. And I'm not going to just have her confront Judge Thunheim. So that agreement was made. Judge Thunheim went on. We allowed Oprah to show the Dave Powers film. It was the first time it had aired anywhere. So she had the first run of it. She showed it. Marina Oswald was on the show separate from Judge Thunheim. She was mad at me because we had a letter exchange, and she was seeking some files that an author had said existed, that we said we don't know of those records. We haven't been able to find them. We've tried. We see a dead end, and she didn't believe us. And so on national TV on Oprah, I was sitting in the front row waiting for Judge Thunheim to come out for his segment, and Marina Oswald called me out on national TV saying something like that Mr. Samoluk has not been cooperative with me. So it was another interesting chapter, Robbie. For me, what was a most interesting 4 years in the mid 90s.
Was Doug Horn the only dissenter amongst the members of the ARRB? And did you not look
You
in?
know, and of course, I know Doug. I saw Doug in Washington. I think it was September of 2019 when I was interviewed for the Oliver Stone a documentary. It was cordial. Said hello. I don't agree with everything that Doug says. He's been obviously very public and very pointed, and is a great researcher. I can't say I agree with a lot of what he has said, but I give him credit for doing his homework. And the records were meant for everybody to draw their conclusions, and he was very much a part of it. Was he the only quote dissenter, you ask? Um, I don't really know. I mean, I think that both the staff and the review board, certainly people had their opinions, and I have my opinion, but I don't think it in any way impacted what we did for our jobs, which was to find records, declassify records, and make them available to the American public. And that's what we did, regardless of what anyone had as a personal opinion. And I think the review board, all of whom are passed away now, except for Judge Thunheim, I think that they at various times expressed opinions, but they were committed historians and lawyers and archivists that wanted to see that record as robust as possible and would take the road wherever it led us.
Now, did all the responses you get in kind of the interviews back when you were, talking on Oprah, or when you were just any emails that were sent to you, or letters back and forth from researchers that have done, obviously you can read their work, they probably explained in paragraphs, but you see how many people were interested in the assassination, where it kind of like, you watching it when you're a kid, everything kind of transpiring afterwards when it comes to still having an interest after all the literature that came out about it. I mean, you weren't the only one that was interested. I mean, look at me. I'm 25 years old now, and I'm interested in the assassination, even though I'm way late to the game. But also, I might be coming in right at the good time.
Well, and I'm so pleased that you are interested in the records because it kind of validates what the law sought to do, validates the work of the review board, and those who are very proud of what we did as staff members or as members of the board. So I think that the fact that you are looking at records and you may very well find something. There are authors who have written books about JFK, not specifically about the assassination, but in my library right here, I have a recent biography by Professor Fred Logevall on JFK, which is a great book. It's volume one. It goes until 1956, and the book it ends at the point where JFK has just not gotten the nomination to be the vice presidential candidate in 1956 with Adlai Stevenson. And Professor Logevall is working on volume two, which will go from 1956 through the assassination. And he benefited from, as you said, you were late to the game. Professor Logevall benefited from being late to the game by seeing records, not necessarily about the assassination, but records that prior biographers had not had available to them. Like Robert Dallek had written a JFK biography in 1983. There were a lot of records that weren't available at that point, but they were when Fred Logevall wrote his book that was released about 2 or 3 years ago.
Uh, I just got a couple more questions for you, but do you know anything about Fritz's interrogation of Oswald? That's like a big area for me.
Yeah, that was another interesting chapter because we wanted to find out what records existed from the interrogation, and this has not been written a lot about it. Got some coverage, I think, because we did release these records that I'm going to reference at the time we found them. But I remember we had written to, I think we found a family member, a surviving family member of Captain Fritz. And it led us to, I believe, a lawyer representing Captain Fritz or Captain Fritz's family because he was long deceased. And we said what we were seeking, any records that may have survived with a focus on the interrogation, but interested in anything else. And then one day, this is my recollection, at the ARRB headquarters in Washington, I got a packet, like a manila envelope. And if I recall correctly, there was a cover letter from the attorney that we had been dealing with. And he basically said, this is what we found. And the family does not want to be interviewed. The family does not want to talk with anyone, but they freely contribute these records. And there were handwritten notes. There's no way of validating at that point, but we believe them to be handwritten notes by Captain Fritz taken during contemporaneous with the interview. The way they were written, I think that was our thought, that they were in fact contemporaneous, although they might have been shortly after. But he took notes about the assassination, and we made those available to the media. I forget whether that was 96 or 97.
97.
Got some coverage, 97. So I don't know. Are you familiar with those records? Yeah, there's probably nothing I can mention to you, Robbie, that you haven't dealt
Go
with.
ahead, please do.
No, but you've done great research. Yeah, so those became part of the record, I think. And I was not directly involved in this, but one of my colleagues on staff, I believe we also got some notes that Hosty, FBI agent Hosty, had taken, which was interesting. He was coming out with a book of his own at that time in the mid 90s. And that was kind of a factor in our discussions with him. But my recollection is that the original thought and what people had said was there were no contemporaneous notes with the interrogations of Lee Harvey Oswald. And I think we ended up getting the Fritz and Hosty notes. Whether that was everything, of course, we don't know. But we found them. And I remember when I was opening up the file with the Fritz notes, the original notes, and I was with one of the analysts was with us, who more directly than me dealt with the actual original records that we were getting and reviewing from the various federal agencies. So I'm holding, just having opened up the manila envelope that came in the mail, and I'm holding the records, and we're reading the cover letter from the attorney and realizing what they are and the original records. And my colleague Kevin says, Tom, I think it's time for us to put on the white gloves. And we did, because and that's what he was used to, wearing the white gloves, dealing with all those federal records. But so that it's another example that was obviously at the municipal level related to Dallas, but we looked hard for records that we thought would be of interest, and I think we did add to the richness of the assassination record.
How thoroughly did anybody look through Hostie's notes? Because he said something that wasn't exposed until Bart Camp, and this is another theory about Oswald. It's prayer man. I don't necessarily buy that, but there is a statement in Hostie's notes where he talked about getting a Coke for his lunch and then going out to go watch the parade. So that's a big, obviously, conspiracy. I wouldn't say conspiracy, but it's one that's very controversial subject in the Kennedy assassination. Is there's photographs of someone that does look like Oswald standing on the front steps. I don't necessarily go into that because I feel like if you want the public interest, you don't really have to deal with that, because it's kind of like trying to study specific individuals like Ruth Paine or any of them. You just get lost in kind of the minutia. But do you know why no one really questioned that? That was in his notes.
I don't recall a discussion of that, but certainly Oswald's movements before the assassination, after the assassination, are critically important. And I must say that as Oliver Stone went through in some detail with some witnesses that the Warren Commission didn't pay attention to, like a lot of things, and any researchers watching this will agree. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things that leave us scratching our heads, but the investigation that day was botched from the get-go. There were a lot of mistakes made. Granted, it was 1963 and not 2023, but even for 1963, there were a lot of mistakes made by the Dallas police, and obviously the letting the murder of Jack Ruby happen, excuse me, of Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby is probably, example number one, because how much different things would have been, what we would have known had Lee Harvey Oswald not died. It's just left to speculation, unfortunately.
Well, I appreciate the work that you did for the ARRB, and I'm hoping history will at least write it down. It feels like they only mentioned the Warren Commission. I even talked to, like, if I bring up the House Select Committee on Assassinations to anybody, people are like, "What's that?" And I'm like, "You don't." They investigated Martin Luther King, they investigated JFK, and even Blakey said he doesn't get a mention in the history books, which I mean, that was a good investigation. They were hindered by obviously the CIA as well too, but I used their testimony when I spoke with Posner, because in the Warren Commission it states that they identified Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle by Marina, and the HSCA interviewed her, and Marina didn't know the difference between a rifle and a shotgun. Where I'm just like, there's a lot of things that were proven, whether it was to fit a narrative of obviously it had to be a lone guy, because the communism hype was so big back then, where people would have assumed Cuba, people would have assumed Russia, people still assume that today. So it makes sense to justify those actions. It doesn't always need to be some grand conspiratorial plot, but it just there's needs to be transparency, and I think we both stand in the same boat when it comes to the rest of those documents being released.
And Robbie, you're absolutely correct about the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which issued their final report in 1979. A lot of people don't know that they concluded that there probably was a conspiracy. Now, a lot of it has to do with the acoustical evidence, which a lot of people raise questions.
Everybody hates that one.
But yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, and it's gone back and forth, and there probably will be another round where someone will come out supportive of the work that was done, and then someone else will rebut it. But the point is, I think you're right. I think the House Select Committee did a lot of great work, and you've got the Warren Commission conclusion that there was a lone gunman. It was Lee Harvey Oswald, but you have an official congressional investigation with the record standing that says there probably was a conspiracy. That's not what the Warren Commission said. So people need to remember that. And I think that there's a lot of credible investigation that was done. And releasing the House Select Committee records was as important to me as the Warren Commission records.
Well, Tom, you've given me enough of your time. I'm very appreciative of the time that you did give me to talk about this subject because it has been one that's I've been obsessed with the past couple of months, and hopefully it won't consume the rest of my life. But we'll see. Is there a
Well,
place?
Robbie, thank you for your use of the records and doing what is very credible research and really looking at this in a way through a historic lens. And there are a lot of rabbit holes that one can go down when looking at the assassination. I think the ultimate conclusions are lost to history, but we can still keep fighting to release the records for the American public.
And is there any links you'd like to promote? Do you have any websites or anything people can go to?
No, I live a different life. I still have an interest in the records, but I watch what I can, participate when I can. But I'm a husband. I'm a father of two daughters, and I maintain the interest in the assassination. But I live my other life too. So I wish you well, and all those who continue to be interested in the assassination, because I think it's important to know our history.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast. And stay tuned for our next episode.